I'm Ken Spurgeon. I consult for the museum here, Kansas Oil Museum, and today I spoke about the soldier state, the role of the GAR and Union veterans in Butler County in Kansas. And we have a new exhibit here of some items that we've never had out before that are from Butler County and from our veterans. Butler County had a very vibrant Union veteran organization. We were one of 500 posts in Kansas after the Civil War, all the way into the early mid 20th century. And the museum has had quite a few items from the veterans that we've never had on display. So we just thought it was time to have them on display. So I'm excited to have them out where people can see them for really the first time. I'll just give you a quick introduction to this. I want you to, first of all, I want to make sure when we're done that you go over and look at this small area we've got of connected to the talk. But this is a near and dear story to me, and I'll be brief about that. But what really got me into history myself when I was a little kid was kind of this story, and a lot of people know that. But it was my ancestor who was in the same regiment as a lot of the guys that came out of El Dorado. He came out of Iola, so anyway, this is kind of home cooking for me in the sense of what I really cared about when I was a kid and still do very much. So I'll talk about it. I'm going to probably go through some of these images kind of quick. I looked at, like, a lot of times when you give a talk outside of school, it's a combination of 3 or 4 different lessons you might normally give or whatever. And that's kind of the case today. But especially at the end, I'm going to talk more about El Dorado in the whole thing. But I want to give you a little bit of context on the Kansas part of things. Kansas Day is 2 weeks away. And so this is a bit of Kansas to start with. So I'll jump around, but and certainly, especially later on, I ask questions if you got them. Kansas was called the soldier state after the Civil War, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But of course, the most significant one is the amount of migration of especially Union soldiers to Kansas. This had to do with, of course, the Homestead Act and some things we'll talk about at the end. But for example, El Dorado, probably at one time, 300 to 400 Union soldiers lived here, which is a big number for a town that size. And certainly they were, in many cases, the founders. As we'll get to, like Jerry Connor and those guys, these were also our founders in many cases. I love this photograph. This is a Kansas group, but this is not El Dorado. We'll get to El Dorado. But I love this photograph, and there are a lot of reasons I love this photograph. But I wish I could listen to every one of these guys tell me a story, because I bet they had some. And as my father used to joke about his service, he'd always say, and some of them are true. Right? So that's probably accurate. But I also love the diversity. These African-American guys, this is something that's common in Kansas especially. It's not in every place. I wish it was in every place. But we've got a diverse group of guys here. So I'm just going to dive in and tell you a little bit about Kansas's role. And like I said, I'll work my way at the end to El Dorado. So a lot of people don't realize that we had military forts here before we were a state. And so one of the things, like in Kansas history, I talk about this at a little bit more length. We actually had 8 or 10 forts before we were a state. 3 or 4 of those forts kind of went away quickly. A couple of them were put on trails. They lasted 2 or 3 years. But what I've put up here are the 3 that everybody really remember. And of course, the ones that lasted, right? I mean, everybody knows where these are at. But I also gave a little caveat over here, a little, tip of the cap to a story I bet you've never heard of, or maybe you've never heard of. There was a fort in northeastern Kansas that was put here by the French before the American Revolution. This would be on the kind of the west side of the Missouri. Think Leavenworth or just a little north. Fort de Cavenal. Even 40, 50 years after this happened, Lewis and Clark said they were kind of looking for the remains of Fort de Cavenal, which is incredible that Lewis and Clark were looking for it, right? So that's actually the first fort of any kind that we know about that was in Kansas. But these are the big 3. And of course, 2 of them are still very, very, very active. I'm excited because I'm getting to speak at Fort Leavenworth in like 3 weeks. And that's kind of an honor. I spoke there, but it's been now 10 years or more. And of course, I admire them so much, and so I'm going to get to speak at Fort Leavenworth. But of course, Fort Leavenworth and Fort Riley is still around. Fort Scott had a huge presence at one time, but didn't last really very long as far as an active fort. Town, of course, did. So just like I said, I'm going to go through this kind of quick. Most of y'all know that Kansas was in the center of the Civil War, in the center of the fight pre-war in what we call Bleeding Kansas. But the reason that was the case was because up until the Civil War, states themselves chose whether or not to have or not have slaves. I'm sure you know this. But what had happened over time was that states to the south had allowed slavery, states to the north had outlawed slavery. I won't go into that any deeper, but I could, and I like talking about that because it's an interesting discussion. In 1820, we had the Missouri Compromise, which the Missouri Compromise was the first time we had a latitudinal line that kind of formally separated north from south. It basically made official what was already happening. The line was 3630, and supposedly above the line, no slavery. Below the line, slavery was allowed. They thought they were going to answer the question of more states as they went west. That was on the books for 34 years. Really 30 years, but almost 34 years, if you think about it in one way. So what happens when they get to Kansas and they get ready to discuss a territory here is everybody is saying, well, wait a minute, can't we revisit this? Southerners especially wanted to revisit this. We've had a Mexican War. Texas has been founded and part of the United States, etc. So they want to revisit. So when the Kansas-Nebraska Act passes in 1854, which is why we exist and what created our territory, and here's a picture. When this passes, Northerners are mad. Northerners, people who at least oppose slavery, different levels, they're mad because why are we arguing about a territory we thought was already resolved? That's why Abraham Lincoln said, "Oh no. Are we going to battle about stuff that we already battled about? Why?" So Northerners are mad. Southerners are happier a little bit because they think this gives them an opportunity to extend slave territory. Again, they've just taken Texas a few years earlier, Arkansas about 15, 20 years earlier, and Missouri's actually been a state for 34 years, a slave state. Now, I always say, don't think that everybody in Missouri was for slavery because they were not. It was I call it a microcosm. It was like its own little, north-south almost. So it's not everybody in Missouri was pro-slavery, but it was allowed. It was legal. So Kansas, Nebraska, that's why we have a bleeding Kansas, because people are hacked off about this act. So Northerners and Southerners are going to come from two different directions, of course. And when you come from Michigan in 1854, or you come from Mississippi in 1854, you might as well have come from Mars and Jupiter, because you have no idea what somebody from Mississippi looks like if you're from Michigan, or vice versa. And so when Northerners get to Kansas territory and they see Southerners bringing their slaves, they're ticked off. And when Southerners hear Northerners extolling the virtues of abolition, they're ticked off. And there we go. Over the next 7 years, we have bleeding Kansas. I'm teaching Kansas history this semester. Yesterday, we just spent like an hour in class talking about this painting, because I love the painting, but I said I know some people don't love the painting, and I know why. And I won't get into that because that's also another talk for another time. But a lot of people are like, the 9-foot John Brown is tough. But there's a lot of imagery in all this. But anyway, for 7 years, we have the loss of 200 people. Most of these fights are 5-on-4, 3-on-2. They're fist fights and a few gunfights and what have you. But what does come out of this is a couple things. The first one is Kansans and Missourians really don't like each other. We all know this, right? They really don't like each other in this period. And so we also see a lot of irregularities. We see border conflicts. We see election fraud, a lot of election fraud. I always tell my students, hey, listen, if you're looking for election fraud, let me give you some election fraud. I'll give you some. 1855 Kansas, because we have about 3,000 people. We have about 3,000 more people voting than there are people. That's election fraud, if you're looking for it. So pretty much, that's like a voter return of 182%. We're lucky if we get 50 or 60. That's like 182 or whatever. So that's a problem. But what also happens is a handful of communities do emerge. And one thing I think is kind of interesting is the size of communities. Most of the towns during Bleeding Kansas, like a big town, is about 5,000. That's a big town. Lawrence and Leavenworth, they get to 4 or 5, 6,000 maybe during the war, but they're not very big. And Leavenworth, because of the fort, is a military town, that it has political leanings, might lean a little south at the beginning. By the time of the war, starting to lean more north for a lot of reasons. But Lawrence is always all north, partly because it's founded by New Englanders. And so Southerners refer to Lawrence as the abolitionist hellhole. Like I said, there's bad feelings, right? I'll tell you this quick story. When I was a young guy, real young guy, and I was in college the first time, I went up to Lawrence like with a group of history people, and some woman walked up to me and she said, I think I must have had on my gear. And she said, are you a good Jayhawk or are you a bad Jayhawk? And I never knew there was a bad Jayhawk. And I was like, what? What is she talking about? And she was like talking about, was I the bad Jayhawkers that wanted to do bad things to Missourians, or was I? And I was like, I'm a good Jayhawk. I knew bad wasn't a good thing to say. So anyway, this lasts for about 7 years. A lot of personalities. Dr. Miner wrote in his book, he's right, every newspaper had Kansas on the cover, because how Kansas went might be how the country went. And so all eyes were on Kansas. I think it's arguable that still this was the period more people paid attention to Kansas history, Kansas politics than any other time. Because of course, again, how are we going to tip? Well, we tipped to the Free State side. 4 attempts at a constitution, by the way. We could have gone the other way. The Lecompton Constitution, which was a pro-slavery constitution, came real close to passing at one point, and it did not pass. But anyway, we come in as a union. We come into the union as a free state, and the minute we come in is the minute that the South is seceding. Lincoln has just been elected. They're not seceding because of what he has done. They're seceding because of what they are worried he will do. Because he gets elected in November. He doesn't get sworn in until March, like 5 months in those days. And so it's during that period secession really goes, November, December, January. 11 states are out by the time he swears in. Kansas, like I said, had just come in as the 34th state. And so volunteerism in Kansas was high. We did not need a draft. By the way, there was a draft during the war, but we didn't need it. Because 20,000 of our 100,000 people, not just men, 100,000 people, 20,000 joined. And it is the highest rate per capita in the Union. So a lot of people say, well, we didn't have a lot of people. No, but the people we had were all in. Now, that's not to say there weren't some people who were ambivalent. One of the historians has said there were some people who tried to stay out. That's possible, but the people that did join were very, active, to say the least. So we have the highest rate per capita in the Union. What most people think about when they think about Kansas' role is they think about the irregular stuff, which is what I mentioned here. The raiding, the bad Jayhawkers, right? Missourians who came to raid in Kansas were called bushwhackers or guerrillas. Kansans who repaid the favor, Jayhawkers. I will admit there were definitely bad things on both sides, for sure. But the entire ugliness hit its peak, probably August 21st, 1863, when 400 raiders under the command of William Quantrell attacked the city of Lawrence. They got to that abolitionist hellhole, and they killed about 200 people, unarmed. Pulled men out of houses and shot them on the street. Shot them in their front yards, in their parlors, whatever. Even for irregular warfare, even for guerrilla activity, that was extreme. Then they set the town on fire. If you want to know why so much brick is in Lawrence today, it's because when that was over, they used brick. A lot of it was wood before, brick after. Out of the ashes of the raid came the University of Kansas, because that's how it worked. Quantrill did raid other places. He raided Olathe. He raided a small town called Aubrey. And he also raided Baxter Springs. That's called the Baxter Springs Massacre, or the Fort Blair Massacre. So he raided other places, but that's what people remember. I tell you that because 4 or 5 of Kansas's regiments specifically were to chase guerrillas. That was their job. The guys of the 9th Kansas, Jerry Connor, that was his job. My ancestor, that was their job. They were chasing Quantrill. Not just Quantrill, but others too, but that's who they were heading or trying to find. So the irregulars, what people kind of remember. But what I want to tell you today is that we had about 15 regiments of regular soldiers. About 15 regiments of regular soldiers. So a regiment ideally was 1,000 men. It wasn't 1,000 men very long between health and whatever. It would go down pretty quick. But it was 1,000 intentionally. It was supposed to be 10 companies of 100 men. And so we had about 15 regiments that were raised as regular soldiers, regular blue coat Union soldiers. Most of those regiments fought primarily in the West, Missouri, Arkansas, Oklahoma, which was then Indian Territory, etc. The 9th Kansas, which we're going to come back to them a little bit at the end here, the 9th Kansas was primarily in the West. They did fight at places like, they did fight in pitched battles. Some of them fought at Pea Ridge, Cane Hill, Prairie Grove, Cabin Creek, Wilson's Creek, and others. So there were some regular fights, but a lot of the time they were, like I said, they were in pursuit. Kind of almost like trying to snuff out leads to some extent. There were 3 regiments that went back east. And of course, when I say east here, I'm talking Kentucky, Tennessee, Georgia, etc. The 1st Kansas saw action in the Vicksburg campaign, which would be Mississippi and Alabama. There's a little monument to the 1st Kansas at Vicksburg. It's kind of weak. It's a sunflower, which I like sunflowers, but it needs a little more to it. The 8th Kansas was the one that went the furthest east. They went all the way to Georgia. They fought with Sherman through Atlanta, marched to the sea. They've got an interesting story. They lost 54% of their men. So they saw the worst casualties. And then the 10th Kansas also went back Kentucky, Tennessee area. Kansas also raised 3 African American regiments and 2 Native American regiments. We were the first state to raise an African American regiment. There's a movie called Glory that people know about. It's a great movie. I like the movie. We were before them. What was different was we couldn't quite get into combat, but we were raised before them. We were also raised illegally because it's Kansas and you got to do that. That we were waiting on the word to make it official, like you can do it. And Jim Lane, who was a little too much, he just went ahead. He got the approval about 6 months after he was doing it. So, but we were the first state to have African American troops. So the only pitched battle that was fought in Kansas is called the Battle of Mine Creek. Now remember what I said, there's a lot of skirmishes and raids and massacres and bad stuff. And there's an incredible story. Some of you have heard me tell this story. There's an incredible story of pro-Union Native Americans trying to get out of Oklahoma to Kansas, who ended up only about 30 miles, 40 miles east of where we are now. But most of those were, like I said, refugee moments and escape moments and little here, little there. One kind of regular battle, and this is it. And if you haven't gone there, I hope you go there. This is not too far from Fort Scott, north of Fort Scott, on 69 Highway, which we call the Military Highway, Military Road. This was a large-size cavalry battle. This happened at the end of what's called Price's Raid. At the end of the war, Confederate General Sterling Price tried to take back Missouri for the Confederacy. And he fought a series of battles in Missouri. He basically made kind of a circle, half circle, where he starts in eastern Missouri, almost goes along today's I-70, goes to Kansas City. In fact, the time the most Union troops were around Kansas at all was in Price's Raid. Because when he's heading for today's Kansas City, everybody and their brothers grabbing a weapon. I mean, it was a Lexington and Concord moment almost. And they all showed up in Kansas City. And that's where we fight. We fight the Battle of the Blue, the Battle of Westport, and some of these actions right there. They turned the Confederates. The Confederates, like I said, look like they're heading west into Kansas on what's today I-70. They turned the Confederates, and now the Confederates go south down Mine Creek, or down towards Mine Creek. And how this battle went is interesting. So the Confederates are hustling from a big fight in Kansas City. A small group of Union soldiers are pursuing them. And when the Confederates get to today's Mine Creek, north of Fort Scott, they come upon a creek that has these huge, it's a huge descent into the creek. You know, there's no bridge, there's no ford, there's no crossing. And so when the Confederates are hustling and they don't know the terrain, they're hustling, and they get right to the Mine Creek and they have to hit their brakes because they can't cross. 7,000 Confederates who just have been kind of beaten up in KC have to stop. And when they stop, they turn around and here's this band of 2,600 Union soldiers. Earlier in the war, you might see a situation where the Union guys would hold up, but not here. They're very aggressive. And so the Union guys run right into them and beat them. So a Union force of 2,600 defeats a Confederate force of 7,000. And again, because the Confederates are kind of in disarray. They've just kind of been beaten up. So this is an important battle. It's also an important battle because that's the end of the Confederacy in the West. These Confederates are done. Some of them go to Mexico. Some of them go back to Missouri, but they're done. And so Mine Creek is a significant battle. We fought really hard to get back the land of Mine Creek. It's just in the last 10 or 20 years that the Mine Creek Battlefield Foundation has been getting back the land. It's part of why Kansans need to go check it out. It's right on the border on the Kansas side. Here's a painting from the battle. And here's an image. I got to tell you a quick little side story. And I knew this. I didn't learn this until 20 or 30 years ago. So my father's family was Union. My mother's family was Southern and Confederate. So we joke around in Civil War reenactment communities and whatever. I've joked around that I'm an SOB, a son of both. Thank you very much. But my mom's family was convinced they were all Rebs. And so they would talk that way. You know, they would talk like, they were from Arkansas and whatever. So when I started doing genealogy and all that 20 or 30 years ago, I was like, I got to sort this out because I know these names, And it turned out that one of my mom's great-grandfathers was a Union soldier. And not only that, he was an officer. And not only that, he'd seen a lot of action. And it also turned out that my Yankee ancestor and my Confederate ancestor fought each other right here. And so my Union ancestor was right here in the 4th Missouri State Militia, and my Confederate ancestor was right here in the 3rd Missouri. And why that's interesting is because they came from the same place, and when the war was over, they went back to the same place, and they went to the same church, and their kids married each other. And and if you go to the cemetery today, they're buried right by each other. And I was thinking to myself, if those two men could get along after this was over, I imagine we should be able to get along. You know what I mean? Because they had I'd love to have talked to them. They both survived 40 years after the war. But anyway, it's the one time I'm sure of they saw each other or were across from each other on the battlefield. So that's kind of cool at Mine Creek. Like I mentioned, I'll keep moving, but this was the unit that saw the most action from Kansas. Lost the most men too. And this was the colonel of that unit, and he became quite popular because he became one of our major legislators after the war, and then he also served as the governor of Kansas, John Martin. Okay, now I'm doing a little Kansas history. Because this is cool. 1/3 of our counties are named after Civil War soldiers. 1/3 of our counties are named after Native Americans, which I think is really cool, right? So since we're in Butler County, we got to have a moment here. Since we're in Butler County right now. We're named after a Southern legislator, Andrew Pickens Butler. I'd love to change the name, but don't be mad at me for saying that. Because I won't do anything. But that's one of those moments where it's sort of surprising. Several counties were named after Southerners before the war. The war came, and a lot of people changed them. For example, Emporia was Breckinridge County, and they changed it to Lyon. Some of you all know that our county was Remember how it was moved around so much? Hunter, Otto, Butler, all the name that changed. But anyway, our name stuck around. So we're named after the Southern legislator Andrew Pickens Butler. But here are all the counties named after Union soldiers. It's a lot. Don't worry, we won't go through them all. But of course, Sedgwick nearby and McPherson. This is two generals. I've given several talks on John Sedgwick. John Sedgwick was a great guy. Sadly, what everybody remembers about John Sedgwick is his last words. His last words were, "They couldn't hit an elephant from this distance." So don't say that. That's a thing to not say at war. John Sedgwick's last words were they couldn't hit an elephant at this distance. And then he got killed. If you go to West Point, some of you guys may know this story, but if you go to West Point, it's good luck if the cadets during finals week go over and spin the spurs of General Sedgwick. And so I was at West Point, and I went over and asked these cadets, I was like, "Do you guys go over and spin those spurs?" I said, "I'm from Sedgwick County. I need to know this." And he goes, "Yeah, we do." He said, "You'll see lines of cadets behind the Sedgwick statue to spin the spurs for good luck," which I think is just funny. I don't know how it got started, but that's kind of cool. I want to tell you about a couple of interesting characters before I just come back to El Dorado here. If you don't know this famous Kansan, she's famous to me anyway. This is Mother Bickerdike. A lot of people know about Clara Barton and the American Red Cross, and she's amazing. But Mother Bickerdike was literally a mother who was also her own nurse and went to war and ended up serving almost 3 years in camps and battlefields and everything, nursing and being amazing. And everybody loved her. They got mad because a woman was so close to everything. And this is the beginning of women nursing. A lot of men did not want a woman in camp. At one point, they went to General Sherman and said, "We need her out. Get her out of here." And he said, "I can't. She outranks me." He was so enamored with her and her just all the work that she'd done. When the war was over, she was from Illinois, but when the war was over, like these men, she came to Kansas. She settled Bunker Hill, Kansas, Salina, Russell area. And she lived the rest of her life there. She was so beloved that even veterans would go to see her and make trips. There's a famous story of a veteran from California who remembered her kindness from the war and had no one and no family. And he asked if he could come stay at her house when he was dying. And he did. So Mother Bickerdike is an amazing person. There's a Bickerdike Hospital up there and whatever, but I feel like she's a person who needs a book written about her, a good-sized book written about her.
Was she ever connected with any of the Kansas regiments?
No, not one specific regiment.
Okay, she basically was back east there.
She was, her son was in an Illinois regiment, and that's kind of how it all started. She kind of followed her son to war. She also was in the Grand Review, and I think she got a pension in the end. She may be the only woman, I've forgotten this now because I haven't thought about it, but I know everybody wanted her to get a military pension because for all intents and purposes, she served. And then if you don't know, this is a fun Kansas story. If you don't know this, the little girl that wrote the letter to Abraham Lincoln before he became president that said, if you don't know about Grace Bedell, she wrote a little letter to President Lincoln, when he was running, and said, "I have 3 brothers." She said in a nice way, "You're homely. You're not very handsome. But if you grew a beard, I would tease my brothers to vote for you." And the story goes that, of course, that was one of the reasons that he started growing that facial hair that he'd never had. But when he went to New York later on a campaign stop, this really happened. And this is from New York. He asked if Grace Bedell was in the crowd. And they brought her forward. So the letter must have made an impression upon him. Anyway, she moved to Kansas right after the war, and she lived the next, you guys see how long she lived. She lived till 1936 in Delphus, Kansas, north of Salina. And people referred to her as Lincoln's little girl. She married a doctor, and that's where Dr. Billings. Okay, and we did all that to get to this. When the war was over, because of the Homestead Act said if you claim 160 acres and you get on it, stay on it for 5 years, you got to squat, which means don't mark it and move. Get on it, stay on it, and make improvements. After 5 years, it's yours free and clear. You got all these veterans. They couldn't pay them the kind of pensions that they probably deserved. So one of the things the federal government did was they told veterans, for every day you served, you can take it off the 5 years. So if I serve 4 years, I only have to squat for 1 year and the land is mine free and clear. Here they came. This is one of the reasons why the incentive was so high to come to Kansas. For one, mostly just eastern Kansas was settled, so there was a lot to settle. And for two, the pension and chance of free land quicker than anybody else. So that's why we're going to become the soldier state. So posts were formed all over the country, and Kansas was very prominent, as we'll talk about in a minute. This is another Kansas photograph. Here's a ribbon from Olathe. The organization they formed was called the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic. There was a Confederate organization too called the United Confederate Veteran. What's different about this is this group, of course, had been loyal to the Union, so they had the patriotic upground for right now. And also what was different about it is when people ran for president, they knew this was a huge voting bloc. This is millions of people, not to mention their families, right? At least for a time. And so let me think here real quick. Here's how many next presidents to come are going to be members of the GAR. President Grant, Rutherford Hayes, James Garfield, Chester Arthur, Benjamin Harrison, and William McKinley, all members of the GAR. So what is that? Whatever that is, 6 presidents in the next 35 years are going to be Union veterans and GAR members. By the way, sometimes they would use a negative. The negative was that, of course, the Republican Party was new before the war, and now it was the biggest party because of Lincoln. And they called it waving the bloody shirt. Waving the bloody shirt was when you'd get up to let's just imagine, I'm at a political debate, and I'm on this side of the stage, I'm a Republican, Democrats over there. The Democratic Party had been split during the war, Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats. So sometimes you weren't sure where they were on allegiance, right? Waving the bloody shirt was when a Republican or a GAR member would say things like, I don't know what my opponent did in the late war, but I know that no Republican fired at a United States flag. That's waving the bloody shirt. People are like, oh, okay, he's more patriotic. And it worked. And so, that was just something people would use from time to time. They could make that claim. And it was a legit claim. I'm not saying it wasn't, but they made it. So Kansas ended up with 500. That's a ton. If you look at a lot of states, that's a ton. Kansas ended up with 500 GAR posts. When we get done and you go into the area over there, it lists, and I've already forgotten, it's 11 or 12 were in Butler County. El Dorado had 1. Wichita had 2. It sometimes was the size of town, but I've seen some small towns sometimes that had 2 posts. And I'm always like, I'm guessing that could have been political things. It could have been Republicans and Democrats splitting. It could be, several things could be involved in why they had multiple posts. But we just had 1, and it was the W.H. Wallace post number 66. But I want to tell you this too, because even today we could go to the cemetery and you will see real markers, original markers from the time. The GAR was the original group, but there were 5 allied orders. The GAR, Grand Army of the Republic, that's the veteran themselves. That's obviously got an expiration date. That's going to end when the last veteran dies. And that was 1956. The last time they met was about 6 years earlier when 5 of them gathered, the last 5 veterans that could gather in 7 or 8 years before 1956. The second group is the Women's Relief Corps. Okay, the thing with the Women's Relief Corps is you didn't have to have any kind of connection. Most of the time it was a daughter, a wife, someone related, but it might not be. So WRC is really big. That organization got really big. I put them in the order I did kind of by size. So Women's Relief Corps. For example, we had a Women's Relief Corps until about 50 years ago. A lot of things that were donated to the museum here, donated by the WRC. They became the caretakers of the GAR. The next group was the ladies of the Grand Army of the Republic. That was wives. And again, that's got an expiration date. But that was at the beginning anyway. That was going to be wives. And then you have the sons of Union veterans and the daughters of Union veterans. Of course, they're still around. This is the earliest group picture that I have that's from El Dorado. Now, there's probably some out there, and the last month, I've been digging, trying to find more. But you'll see this photo in the exhibit. This photo was taken in front of the GAR Hall at First and Gordy. We'll talk more about that in a second. I can do some speculating, but I'm not sure who they all are. And there's nothing on the original image. So again, other than some speculation, I can't be for sure. But this picture is also taken at the GAR Hall. And the identity of these guys is listed over when you go over into the exhibit area. You'll see their names. We've got their names. And the ladies. Here's the ladies right here too, as well. The last veteran that I know of in El Dorado was the late 1930s. Some of them, we know about them, but they did the post basically, by 1933, looks like nobody's meeting. None of the men are meeting. Some of them are living, but they might have been in just bad enough health they couldn't travel. And I love this photograph for a lot of reasons, and you'll see two versions of this in the other room. This is cool because we're getting to look at the building, which is still standing, and you can see the GAR. And you can also see the women. There's a picture of this with less, and then there's a picture of this with more of the women. This is dated to about 1935. And so, let's see, let me think here. We're looking north. Yeah, we're looking north here. I want to tell you about a couple of important people. You know this, some of these folks, I'm sure. You know the names for sure. Here's Alfred Ellett, who became General Alfred Ellett. He had an interesting story, and certainly he was one of El Dorado's founders. He was born in Pennsylvania. When he was about 16, his family moved to Illinois, which is where he joined the Civil War. He actually was in 2 regiments. He was 40 when he joined, but he was in 2 regiments. He had 2 brothers who also joined from Pennsylvania. So it turned out there was 3 or 4 Ellett brothers in the unit or in the service at the same time. What's interesting about him is he actually became the lieutenant colonel of an infantry regiment, fought at Pea Ridge. I've wondered sometimes if it's what made him interested in the area, because his regiment came out to Kansas and Missouri. But he fought at Pea Ridge and some other places. And then in late 1862, his brother got command of something called the Ram Brigade, which was almost like blockade busters, for lack of a better word, on the Mississippi River. So he became a commander in that group. In fact, 5 Ellets ended up coming into that Ram Brigade. They called it the Mississippi Ram Brigade because of the river they were on. He fought at the Battle of Memphis, and he also fought in the Siege of Vicksburg, which is the big deal, of course. And then in 1864, he resigned from the service. Of the 5 or 6 Ellets that served, like all but him and one more, 4 of them died. 3 or 4 of them died in the service. But anyway, Alfred lived, and then after the war, he came to El Dorado, where he was a businessman, and I'm sure you all know he was very active in the GAR Post. Of course, the Ellett Opera House and other things were named for him, and we've got this monument to him outside of, right outside the building. This is Jerry Connor, of course, of Connor Cabin fame, and we have lots of other photos of him, but this is the one that came from a commemorative thing that we've got. Jerry and about 10 men joined the 9th Kansas Cav. So Jerry's unique because Jerry got here and then joined from here. There was very few people here at the time. I will tell you something about Ellett and Connor. By all things that I can see, they at least said publicly for sure they were very adamantly anti-slavery. Connor was born in Ireland, but had grown up in New England. So he seemed to have a kind of a New England bent for sure. Comes here, think about the places this man went, from Ireland to New Hampshire, to El Dorado, Kansas, to the war, back to El Dorado, goes back to New England and gets married in Vermont to his first wife, comes back to Kansas. That's a lot of traveling in those days. Lives here for the next 30 or so years, raises a family, gets married a second time, goes to California and dies in California. All the family members are buried pretty much here except for Jerry, who died about 1915. But anyway, he was in 9th Kansas Cav, Company C. And I could tell you more about his service. I've kind of dug into his service a little bit more. But again, most of it was guerrilla activity, etc. I've been saying kind of first in Gordy. And I wrote it down and I forgot to have it with me. But you guys know where I'm talking about. I bet everybody knows where I'm talking about. What you may not know about is, and I should have had a picture from the others. Here I'm looking south, right? I'm looking south. The pictures we saw of the veterans, they were on the other side of the building. You can kind of see the doorways still. This is a church now. This was a church 100 years ago. It was doubling as a church and a GAR hall. But what I didn't know until a few months ago, I just hadn't noticed. I'd noticed that there's a GAR monument by the building. You guys see it? You may all know, maybe you don't know. I didn't know. I've walked over there several times, but I all of a sudden just turned around and I was like, wow, there is a GAR marker right there. You know, the funny part about that story is, because I was in my own brain going, do I have the right building? Am I sure that this is the right? You know, I was having that moment, and I'm like, have I got the right building? I've got the right building. It's right there. Donated by W.H.L. Wallace Women's Relief Corps, 1980. So that was surprising to me. When you go to the exhibit here in a minute, you're going to see several things, and I wanted to highlight a couple, and this is my last one, and then I'll take questions if you got them. So we have in the museum, most of what we have is letters, things like that, a few letters. We have all the ledger books pretty much of the GAR. I mean, their notes, meetings. The WRC, their notes from meetings. I didn't put any out, partly because it was difficult to know what to put out. I may still put something out later. But what we also have is about 100 to 150 medals and ribbons. And I went through them all. And I tried to kind of almost find the best of the best, those that were in good shape, etc. So let me tell you real quick about these medals. This is near and dear to my heart because it tells you a little bit about some of the people. So what you would have, and by the way, and ironically, every one of them would have had a membership medal, and of those we have none. I could not find one membership medal. I have a theory. It's only a theory. A lot of those guys, I know this from other stories, a lot of those guys were buried with their medal on. So it's very possible that most of them took it to the grave. But they're around. But anyway, I was looking for like one membership medal, couldn't find one. But what I do see, and by the way, I do see a couple of, there's a WRC medal in the case. Maybe it's this one. This is the WRC medal. So what you'll notice when you're looking at these is a lot of times they're other locations. And so that makes people go, well, wait a minute. If they're ours, why are they at other locations? It's our guys who are going to things at other locations, if that makes sense. So for example, here's a good one. Here's a ribbon. And by the way, ribbons don't last as long. Here's a ribbon from the National Encampment in Kentucky in 1895. So that's a guy from the Wallace Post who went to the National Encampment in Louisville, Kentucky, came home, kept his ribbon, and we still got it. And you could do several like this. Now, this is a department medal. So this is probably somebody who actually was at one time in a Colorado regiment, a Colorado post. That's a national encampment, Buffalo, New York. That's a state encampment from Wichita. That's a state encampment from Lawrence. We've got one, or maybe this is the LA. We've got one from Los Angeles National Encampment. So they vary. Got a couple of Potwin. When you see a black one like this, someone probably passed away. They would put on their mourning ribbon for a while. But we've got a couple of Potwin medals. And here is the one that I know that's ID'd. This is a WHL Wallace Post number 66 GAR, El Dorado, Kansas. So it's us, and for something here. And this guy's been nice enough, or someone was nice enough, he had a regimental badge, an actual regimental badge he connected to his ribbon. So this was owned by a man named James Lambert, who's buried at Bella Vista. This is his medal right here. And actually, he's in this photo, and I'll probably Carol may remember because we were talking about it one day. I think it's this one. It's one of these two guys. It says in the thing over here when you go there. I forgot my count, but it's one of these two gentlemen right here who is wearing it. So anyway, the medals are something people would kind of go by quickly, but it's a big deal, and it's a big deal that we've got as many as we've got. Okay, so when let me tell you one other thing about the exhibit. So when you go in the exhibit, there's a couple other items I didn't put up here. We've got about 7 or 8 muskets. Play detective with me. I knew they were there. They are all the exact same make. If we have 7 or 8 veterans who were in 7 or 8 different regiments, the odds that they'd have the same make is slim. So I personally think that most of those were bought after the war, or not bought, but acquired after the war. They are from the war, but I think they were acquired for parades. So I think they walked with them in parades. Now, here's the difference. The one you see over here, it says that it was owned by and during the war by a man named Benjamin Allebach, Allebach. He inscribed his name in the butt of the gun. He himself did that. That particular soldier, it'll tell you in the little thing when you read it, he actually was captured at one point at Andersonville. So my theory would be he got that musket after his Andersonville captivity. So that's a cool musket. We also have a GAR ceremonial sword, which would have been the one they used all the time in all the parades. That's pretty special. So it's in the exhibit as well. And there's more. But anyway, that just gives you a feel for some of the few things. I wish I could put out 100 things because it'd be cool. You guys have questions? I know I just like, because that's how I do. Sorry. Yeah.
On the guerrilla warfare, the bushwhackers, aside from up in the northeast and the Fort Scott area, did they do much else? Did they do stuff in real far southeast Kansas?
Yeah.
Or did they come as far as Butler County?
That's a good question. They got a lot of places. They probably didn't come here just because they mostly went to where there were communities.
They went as far as Morris County.
Morris, yeah. They were in Council Grove. They definitely made raids maybe as far west as today's Iola. I'm talking about in the southern part of the state. But yeah, they wouldn't have probably got over here. But that's a good question. Humboldt was sacked, and that's near Iola. So that's about the farthest west that I'm sure of they were at. But it's a good question. If you look at settlement, if I had a map and you look at settlement, it's almost like you could draw a line from like north central down to Baxter. And that's like the third that was kind of settled. But yeah, they raided for sure. If you guys don't know, I wrote a book about a soldier that was also chasing guerrillas. His name was Christian Isley. But he tells a story of finding them. I'll just tell you because it's kind of cool. This was a very strong, devout Christian man, and he was not the kind of person to tell big tales. And in one of his diary entries, this is what he said. We came upon some bushwhackers today. Don't you think we knew what to do with them? Think about that line. I was like, woo, it gave me shivers when I read it because that's literally all he ever said. Don't you think we knew what to do with them? And another entry, he talks about having a run-in with the bushwhackers, and he lost his buddy. He lost his tent mate, and they buried him in Arkansas in a unmarked grave. They tried to make a cross. He also tells you the story about a month later. I came back, I looked for his grave, I couldn't find it. He writes that in his diary too. Like we looked all day for his marker, I couldn't find it. So that would have been the kind of duty that they were involved in. It was pretty ugly, pretty gross. That's called A Kansas Soldier at War. Any other questions you guys have? Yes, Sonia?
In your research, did you come across the name Emily Haynes Harrison? She was the second wife. Harrison, famous.
Oh, okay.
So Harrison, the judge, he was a judge here in El Dorado. William Harrison. It was his second wife. She was a Civil War spy.
Okay.
She ended up becoming very good friends with Claire Martin.
Oh, wow.
And that name had just come to me a couple of years ago. So I was thrilled that you.
Yeah.
But she's got a fascinating story. She was married to His second wife.
Okay, yeah.
And she's a Civil War spy.
You know, when you guys saw this photograph, just made me think of Sonia. When you see this photograph, I'll go way back here, of the women. Somebody said, do we have any wives here? I think we do. But again, I don't have names on the back of this image, so I don't know. But we have, I would imagine we have some that are still Civil War widows here.
Did you say this photograph itself is dated?
I'm looking at age. The photograph is dated. It's dated in this corner. I found a note that it was taken in like 33 or 34, but one of the prints says 38 or 39, so I'm not 100% sure. It's the 30s, but I'm just not 100% sure. Yeah, I look at a few of these women, like this lady right here. She's old enough to be a widow for sure, and there's several others as well. Any other questions you guys have? Yeah.
Ken, I know we're in Butler County, but Sedgwick County doesn't seem to recognize Homestead much. There's no monument that I know of, or why is that?
Yeah, you know, that's an interesting question. I've given a talk at the Wichita Sedgwick County about John Sedgwick. He's a good guy. I mean, I know I said his last words because it's everybody knows that who studies this, but you know, he has no direct connection except somebody wanted to name the county after him. But I've always guessed, we don't even know, by the way, how that happened. No one knows. There's no note that says, hey, we're going to name it Sedgwick, because we don't know. My theory is that what happened was some guys who'd served under him who really admired him did that, and I think that's cool. But I don't know much beyond that of a connection. So, and the same, by the way, is true of McPherson County. You know, General McPherson was killed at the Battle of Atlanta. So McPherson County is named after General McPherson. It's who they admired, you know, for sure. No doubt about it. Cowley's named after a captain in the 9th Kansas, if you didn't know that. Cowley County is named after a captain in the 9th Kansas. His widow remarried, and her husband was in the war too, and they're buried at Belle Vista. Matthew Cowley's widow is buried at Belle Vista. So yeah, the connections, there's a ton of connections. There's Civil War veterans, by the way, at both cemeteries. So there's, you know, interesting stories at both places for sure. Well, thank you all. And as you leave, like I said, duck in our little kind of community exhibit over here. I know it's not very big, but check it out. And thank you.